Alright, so today I want to show you an example of a sequence diagram. The tool that I'm using is a website. It's called Lucidchart. You can make a free account in there, and you have access to many different tools that help you draw different UML diagrams. The scenario that we're considering for this example is a user withdrawing from their bank account. So what happens is the user enters a command for withdrawal. The command needs to be validated. If it is a valid command, it makes it to the bank, and then bank connects to the bank account for that user to ask for the withdrawal. So in this scenario, which is withdrawal from a bank account, we have our user. So the user in the sequence diagram is called an actor, and it's outside the system. However, we have our objects. So in this case, we have 4 objects based on the interaction that happens between the user and the program. So at first, the user interacts with the terminal to insert the command. The command then needs to be validated. After the validation, it will be passed to the bank, and bank accesses the user's bank account. So the first one is terminal. The second one is validation. Third one is the bank. And the fourth one is bank account. Okay, that works. Now we want to draw the lifelines. Lifelines are vertical lines, and they should be dashed, so we're going to change that to dashed. So they are vertical lines that show the existence of an object or an actor over time. So we want to draw it for each of the actors and objects that we have. Now let's show the interaction between actors and objects. We call each of these interactions a message, and each of those messages can have a reply message. The difference in representing a message and a reply message is whether they are a solid line or a dashed line. So let's see an example. Our user wants to withdraw some money from their account. So the first thing that happens is that the user inserts the command into the terminal. So we pick an arrow, and it has to be a solid line because it's not a reply. So this is a message from the actor to the terminal, and we can call it insert command. Okay. Then the terminal has to send a message to the validation. In our case, we want to check whether the inserted command is a valid command or not. Pay attention that this second one is a bit lower than the first one because it shows the passage of time. So it tells us that the user inserts the command and then the validation happens. We can call this is valid. Now, in validation, we have to say whether this command is valid or not. Since it's the answer to this message is valid, we represent this message with a dashed line. So we are going to consider the case that it is valid. So let me adjust the diagram. All right. So let's say the command is valid. So the bank receives the command, and then bank has to check with the bank account to see whether there is sufficient funds. So this will be solid. So the bank is asking the bank account whether there is sufficient amount. And let's say there is. So the bank account tells the bank that there is a sufficient amount for this withdrawal. So we can say yes. And then bank needs to send the message to the terminal that a successful withdrawal has happened. So we are going to connect bank directly to the terminal. We don't need to get back to the validation anymore from here. So we just send the message that there was a successful withdrawal. And then the terminal sends a message to the user and confirms the withdrawal. A solid line. So this shows the confirmation message. So good. We are considering that there was sufficient funds and we actually withdraw the money. But it's not all the possibilities. There's also a possibility that there isn't sufficient funds in the account. So we have to demonstrate that too. The way that we do it is through an alternative box. So let's find it. And what we want to consider is the question here is it sufficient? And one of the conditions is yes. And we want to position it right, so let's move it to the right place. All right, maybe a little lower. Perfect. Okay, so the condition here is if sufficient. And we also have else. So If it is sufficient, that's what's going to happen. But if it isn't, so let's draw the diagram for that scenario as well. So if the answer here is no, and I want to move it a bit higher so we have enough space. So if the answer is no, the bank sends the message to the terminal saying that there wasn't sufficient funds. So there's a message from the bank to the terminal which says insufficient funds. And then your terminal shows the user an appropriate error message. And this one is solved. This also is solved. Okay. There's also another alternative here. So if you see, we have the user insert the command, and then we're asking if the command is valid. So our assumption is that all of this is going to happen if this command is valid. But what happens if it isn't valid? So in this case, we want to have another alternative here. So it starts here. So I'm just gonna reduce the size of this so it's easier to see the rest of the text. Alright. So this condition here is if the command is valid. So you can say if valid, then all of this is going to happen. And this has to be brackets. But if it isn't valid, then the validation sends a message to the terminal saying that this command is not valid. And then the terminal shows the user an error message. I'm just going to try to make it a little more presentable. Okay, so I worked on this diagram for a bit. Now it's much easier to read and see different parts, and I'm also showing the alternatives in color blue so they're distinguishable. Now for the last part, we want to draw our activation boxes. Activation boxes show when and for how long each object is processing. Under UML sequence, you can find the activation boxes. So we want to put it here. We start from the first object. As we said, the actor is not a part of the system, so we don't need an activation box for that. I'm going to change the color of this box just for the sake of demonstration so that it's easier to distinguish them. from the rest of the lines. So the activation box starts from the first message that is being sent or received for each of the objects and ends with the last message. So for terminal, we have this activation box. Now we draw the activation box for validation, and this is the last message here. We do the same for bank. So this one, command valid, is the first message, and this is the last one, and for the bank account. So the first message and the last message. And now we have our activation boxes.